All right then, we're ready to journey back in time. No suit of armor needed for this trip. We're diving deep into knights, castles, and yeah, even dragons. And you know what? You've already sent me some incredible material. I'm hooked.
Well, it never ceases to amaze me how these things, knights, castles, dragons, how they still capture our imaginations, even after all this time. You'd think they'd be old news, but...
Right. It's like we never really outgrow them. So first things first, knights. Shining armor, always off on some valiant quest, rescuing damsels in distress. How much of that knightly picture is, actually true?
Well, your research hit on something really fascinating. See, while knights, no doubt they were skilled warriors, this whole knight in shining armor thing, it's often blown out of proportion. A romanticized idea. What's more interesting and realistic is that they were bound to lords through, well, feudalism. More like a medieval contract than true chivalry. What do you think?
Yeah, less Sir Galahad and more like, medieval contractors with a code of conduct. Honestly, that makes them even more interesting to me.
Exactly. And that code, chivalry, that's important. One article you sent called it aspirational, not always practical, but it set a standard,
Yeah.
Shaped ideals of honor and integrity that we still, in some ways, value today.
That's a really good point. That even a system with flaws can still give birth to ideals that have lasted. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the systems we have now? What will people in the future think?
That's a great question. One for the ages, really. But for now, want to shift gears from knights to their, iconic homes? Castles. Man, your sources did not hold back in describing these impressive structures.
I know, it's like stepping into a history book.
But what was their real significance? Was it all about defense?
Castles, they were vital, both strategically in terms of military and symbolically. And yeah, they were great for defense, don't get me wrong, but there was more to it. They projected power. One source, I think it was a quote from way back, described a newly built castle as a stone giant on the land, shouting out its lord's might. Powerful imagery, right? Wow. Yeah. It's like the medieval times version of a Fortune 500 company skyscraper. It shows they mean business.
Yeah.
But castles, they weren't just about projecting power, right? There were practical uses too, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. They provided refuge for people when things got dicey, housed workshops, stored grain. Some even had chapels, like self-contained communities, a far cry from those empty ruins we picture now.
That is fascinating. What starts as a symbol of power becomes so much more complex when you look closer. Just goes to show, digging below the surface is always worth it, wouldn't you say?
100%. So, ready to move from the concrete to the, shall we say, more fantastical side of things.
You already know it. Let's talk dragons.
Dragons. Talk about capturing the imagination. There's just something about them, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But let's be real for a second. Our sources are pretty clear. These weren't, actually real, right? No fire-breathing giants roaming around back then.
Sadly, no. At least, not literally. But that doesn't make them insignificant, not even close. Dragons were, and still are, incredibly powerful symbols across so many cultures. One of your sources put it really well. They said, dragons embody the chaos of the unknown, that raw power of nature that both terrified and captivated medieval people. And you highlighted that passage, so it clearly stood out to you, too.
It did. Think about it. Back then, without science to explain things, a huge storm or a sudden plague, that would have been terrifying, like a dragon attack, almost unexplainable.
Exactly. And just like with real dangers, dragons had to be faced, defeated. That's where the symbolism gets really interesting, especially in stories like, St. George and the Dragon. You specifically mentioned that one in your notes, so I'm guessing it resonated.
It did. It's such a powerful image, even knowing it's not meant to be literal. So it's not really about an actual monster then, is it? It's more about conquering fear, overcoming obstacles.
Right. And it's fascinating how differently dragons are depicted across cultures, which you dug into in your research. In a lot of European stories, they're these monstrous, destructive forces. But you pointed out a really cool contrast. In some Eastern traditions, like Chinese mythology, dragons are actually a good thing. They symbolize wisdom, strength, even good luck.
Wow, that's wild. Same mythical creature,
Yeah.
but totally different meanings depending on who's doing the telling. It's a good reminder that even when we think we're dealing with universals, perspective changes everything.
It really does. And that's what I love about diving into this stuff. It's not about finding one right answer, but about appreciating how much complexity there is, all the layers of meaning. Speaking of which, we've been knee-deep in the fantastical. Maybe it's time to swing back to the historical side for a bit. We've covered knights and castles, but what about their legacy? These events happened ages ago, so why should we still care about them today? It's a question worth asking.
That's a great question. It's easy to think of these figures, these stories, as things of the past. But they haven't faded away, have they? They still resonate. Why is that? What do you think?
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? These stories, these figures, they tap into something universal, that fascination with bravery, honor, facing impossible odds, themes that go beyond just one time period or culture, don't you think?
Absolutely. And you see it everywhere, even today. Fantasy books, movie, video games, they're everywhere. They all borrow from those medieval archetypes. One article you sent even connected the chivalric code to modern-day superhero stories. Super interesting stuff.
It really is. Whether it's Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or even classic literature, these stories, they draw on such fundamental human experiences and desires. I think they resonate because at their core, they're about those timeless truths: good versus evil, love and loss, courage and sacrifice. So true. I bet even if someone had never even seen a real castle, they could still look at those towering walls and feel a sense of awe. Imagine the lives lived within those walls, the battles fought. There's a romanticism to it, like a longing for a simpler time, maybe.
And who hasn't imagined themselves slaying a dragon? Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Yeah.
Overcoming that impossible obstacle, achieving the impossible dream. It's like these stories give us a way to understand our own struggles, our own hopes. Wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt. It makes you wonder, though. It makes you wonder, what about our time? What stories, what symbols from our world will stick around for centuries? What will people in the future look back on and say, yeah, that defined their era? What do you think?
Wow, now that's a question. Maybe they'll be studying our obsession with technology, right? Or our struggle with climate change, just like we're fascinated by medieval castles and chivalry. Who knows? That's a question for the history books, or I guess podcasts of the future, right? Maybe they'll have their own deep dive, unpacking it all for us. But in a way, aren't we all already time travelers in a sense?
Mm-hmm.
When we dig into these sources, these pieces of the past, trying to understand, it's like putting together a giant puzzle, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a perfect analogy. And, like any good puzzle, the real satisfaction isn't just finding all the pieces. It's seeing how they fit together, the bigger picture they create.
Exactly. And sometimes those pieces, they can really challenge what we thought we knew. Like, remember when we talked about chivalry?
Yeah.
That code of conduct that sounds so noble, but in reality was full of contradictions. It's a good reminder that history, well, it's rarely black and white, more like shades of gray,
Yeah.
with different perspectives to consider.
Yeah, totally. And it's those little details, those complexities that make these deep dives so fascinating. It's not about romanticizing the past, it's about understanding it, even the messy, complicated parts.
Couldn't agree more. And that understanding, being able to look at the past with both a critical and appreciative eye, I think that can help us make sense of the present, maybe even shape the future in a better way.
Well said. Couldn't put it better myself.
This has been an incredible journey. From the truth about knights to the symbolism of dragons and how these stories still resonate today, this deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how things that happened so long ago can still feel so relevant.
It really is. It speaks to the power of stories, the way they connect us across time, across cultures. A reminder that we're all part of this one big human story.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our journey for today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop seeking out those stories that capture your imagination.